His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, a boy from a forgotten island who carried dreams greater than empires. Mocked for his accent, obsessed with the heroes of Rome, he believed he was destined for greatness, and he was. Within 10 years of his first battle, he crowned himself Emperor of France, and within 20, he would end as a lonely prisoner on a distant island. He rose with the storm of revolution, shattered mighty kingdoms in Italy, and carved his name into history at Austerlitz. Yet in the burning sands of Egypt, his glory began to crack. Why did kings tremble at his very name? Why did thousands follow him into battles they knew could be their last? He gave them victories, but he also gave them belief. He tasted triumph, betrayal, power, and exile. He was celebrated as a savior, condemned as a tyrant, worshipped as a genius, and feared as a madman. Even in his downfall, Spain, Russia, Waterloo, his shadow towered over Europe. 200 years later, the world still asks, was he hero or tyrant, genius or madman, or something far greater? This is not just the story of a man. This is the journey of a soldier who became an emperor and a prisoner who became immortal. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleepy Bed Stories is published here every 3 days. 1769, on the Mediterranean island of Corsica, in the city of Ajaccio, a boy was born into a modest but respected family of local nobility, who was given the name Napoleon Bonaparte. The island had just come under French rule, and this transition was painful. The Corsicans did not consider themselves French. They were proud, freedom-loving, often hot-tempered people, brought up on the traditions of resistance. Only yesterday, the island was fighting for independence under the leadership of Pascal Palis. And today the guns are silent, and French officials are replacing the Corsican laws with their own. Napoleon's father, Charles Bonaparte, came from a modest but ancient noble family. He was educated, dexterous in business, and managed to quickly integrate into the new reality. He went to Paris, had acquaintances, and even received a place on the royal council. But for many Corsicans, this was a betrayal. In the eyes of the locals, Carlo turned from a son of the soil into a servant of the occupation regime. He himself, however, thought differently. He wanted a better fate for his children. It was thanks to his ambitions that the Bonaparte family was able to send their eldest son Napoleon to study in France. Napoleon was not French, either in spirit or in language. At home, he spoke an Italo-Corsican dialect. He knew French poorly, with an accent. At Brienne, the military school where he entered at the age of 9, he found himself an outsider, the son of a provincial nobleman with dirty boots, a gloomy expression, and a quarrelsome character. He was poor, proud, and not good at small talk. He was teased, called a little Corsican. They laughed at his accent and manners, but in response, he remained silent. Not because he was afraid, but because he was saving. He harbored a grudge, and with that grudge came concentration. While others played, he read. While others went on vacation, he stayed in the library. In letters to his parents, he complained about the loneliness and coldness of his comrades. But even then, an inner conviction was forming in him. No one will give him anything. He will take everything himself. He was especially fascinated by Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Plutarch. He copied their actions, studied their strategies. Even then, he began to feel that he was not just a soldier, but a man destined to decide destinies. When his father died, Napoleon was only 15. The family was left practically without funds. Responsibility for his brothers and sisters fell on his mother Letizia, a stern, strong-willed woman, one of those who do not mourn fate, but gnaw at it with their teeth. She instilled in her children that the world is cruel and one must be prepared for it. From her, Napoleon inherited not only character, but also fortitude, as well as a sense of duty to the family. Even after becoming emperor, he would take care of his brothers, handing them thrones, albeit temporary. After Brienne, he entered the Paris military school. This was the pinnacle of what was possible for someone like him, a poor nobleman on the outskirts of the empire. There, they no longer just teased him, they despised him. The French aristocracy looked at him as something exotic and dangerous. But even in this world, Napoleon found his weapon, his knowledge. He began to shine in the exact sciences, especially in mathematics and artillery. He was not just good, he was the first in the graduating class. This is what gave him his first assignment, junior lieutenant of artillery in a regiment stationed in the south of France. He served in Eaux and Alens, wrote an essay on the freedom of Corsica, dreamed of returning to the island, and dreamed of liberating his native land from the French. His early writings were full of pathos and anti-French sentiment. He praised Paoli, whom he considered a hero and martyr. However, when he finally returned to the island to join the resistance movement, everything went wrong. Paoli, who had once seemed like an idol, saw in him an overly ambitious and unpredictable young man. Political disagreements grew into a personal conflict, and soon Napoleon was forced to leave Corsica for good. He returned to France no longer as a Corsican, dreaming of freedom for his homeland, but as a man rejected by both his own and others. The understanding that he no longer belonged to any nationality grew stronger in him, and this became his strength. He would belong only to himself. He would become French not by birth, but by result. Not because he was born in France, but because he would conquer it. At this point, France was on the brink of change. The king was still on the throne, but the ground was already shaking under his feet. Revolution was in the air, and for people like Napoleon, it meant only one thing: chance. While the old order was crumbling, a new man could make a name for himself, not by title, not by family, not by connections, but by abilities. In the second half of the 18th century, France was seething under the outwardly stable shell of the monarchical order. The country's economy was experiencing serious difficulties. The treasury had been depleted by protracted wars, including participation in the American Revolution, and the tax burden fell almost exclusively on the shoulders of the Third Estate, peasants, artisans, and city dwellers. The privileged classes of the clergy and nobility lived carefree, paid no taxes, and retained political influence, which caused growing irritation and a sense of injustice. The monarchy under the rule of Louis XVI seemed helpless in the face of the brewing crisis. Attempts at reform were failing. The royal court was becoming increasingly disconnected from reality, while hunger, inflation, and discontent were spreading throughout the country. Enlightenment ideas, which had recently seemed the prerogative of philosophical salons, began to penetrate the masses. People increasingly asked questions about equality, justice, and the right to participate in the fate of their country. And in the end, these processes resulted in open revolution. The storming of the Bastille became a symbol of the new era. The old order was collapsing. The king was losing power, the nobility was losing land, and the church was losing influence. Instead of the familiar France, an unknown and turbulent republic was emerging in which everything became possible. Both, buried to rise and fall. For young people like Napoleon Bonaparte, this was a historic chance. He was just 20 years old when the revolution began. He served in the artillery, had no wealth, no connections, and a humble title. But now it no longer mattered. The revolution had not just opened doors, it had torn down walls. The army was in dire need of capable officers. The nobility had fled the country en masse, and the officer corps was empty. This was the first window of opportunity. Bonaparte first really came into his own in 1793, during the siege of Toulon, a key port captured by supporters of the monarchy and handed over to the British. The siege dragged on. The command was indecisive, and then a young artillery captain proposed a plan that seemed daring but precise: capture Fort La Guillette, which dominated the harbor. It was this fort that allowed control of the port waters and essentially decided the outcome of the entire operation. Despite his youth and low rank, Bonaparte insisted on implementing his plan and achieved success. The French troops took up positions. The English left Toulon, and Bonaparte himself received the rank of brigadier general. He was only 24 years old. His name became known in Paris. Some admired his courage and technical genius. Others began to suspect that this man was dangerous, too decisive, too independent, too fast rising. The path to the top was also made easier by the fact that Bonaparte had a patron, Augustin Robespierre, the brother of the main leader of the Jacobins. Thanks to this support, he strengthened his position, but at the same time found himself in a vulnerable position. The fall of Robespierre in the summer of 1794 dragged down all those who collaborated with him. Bonaparte was arrested and kept under surveillance for some time. His fate hung in the balance. Fortunately for him, the political storm quickly gave way to another. A few months later, he was released and sent to serve in the Army's topographic department. The appointment was symbolic, almost a punishment, working at a drafting table far from the front and glory. Bonaparte perceived this as humiliation, as an annoying pause, but he did not break. He waited. His chance came in the autumn of 1795. Paris was on the brink of a new uprising. The Royalists were going to take the capital to restore the monarchy. The Republican government had virtually no forces to repel the attack. Then Paul Barras, one of the leaders of the Directory, joined the matter and remembered the man who had once saved Toulon. Bonaparte was entrusted with the defense of Paris. He acted quickly and decisively. The most important streets and squares were blocked by artillery. All approaches to the city center were controlled. When, on the 13th of Vendémiaire, October 5th, 1795, according to the new style, the rebel columns moved on the offensive, Bonaparte gave the order to fire without hesitation. Grapeshot rained down on the attackers, destroying their ranks. The capital was filled with smoke, panic, and screams. The battle ended as quickly as it had begun. The victory was complete, and at the same time brutal. Bonaparte did not negotiate, did not waste time. He acted as a military man, not a politician, and this is what brought him recognition. Barras made him his favorite, and Bonaparte received a new, much more influential appointment, commander of the internal troops. Now he was not just a talented officer, but a figure with real political weight. Everyone who followed his career understood that he would rise further. But the real takeoff, the first campaign which would make him an idol of all France and a nightmare for Europe, was waiting ahead in Italy. After the execution of Louis XVI in 1793, the French Revolution ceased to be an internal conflict. The monarchies of Europe, Austria, Prussia, Spain, England, and others, perceived the new republic as a threat to the very foundation of their power. The ideas of freedom, popular sovereignty, and the rejection of the monarchy, rapidly spreading from Paris, caused alarm in the royal courts. Thus, one after another, coalitions arose, combining the efforts of the old regimes. France found itself surrounded. In the east, the Austrians were advancing. The British dominated the sea. The Spanish threatened in the south, and rebellions broke out within the country, the bloodiest of which was the Vendée. By 1796, the Republic stood firm, but it was exhausted. The economy lay in ruins, the army was exhausted, and confidence in the Directory was undermined. In order to retain power and breathe new energy into the country, the government decided to strike a blow that could change the course of the war and regain the political initiative. This blow was the campaign in Italy. The military and political logic of this choice was simple. Austria, France's main enemy on the continent, controlled northern Italy. If the Austrians were forced out of these territories and their ally, the Kingdom of Sardinia, was knocked out of the war, France would have the opportunity not only to weaken one of the coalition leaders, but also to create a network of dependent republics that would serve as a buffer and a source of resources. But at that time, the army stationed on the Italian front was in dire straits. the soldiers wore worn-out clothes, were malnourished, and suffered from disease and lack of discipline. It was there in March 1796 that the 26-year-old General Napoleon Bonaparte appeared. He was not a veteran of major battles, did not have an aristocratic background, but he already had Toulon, the suppression of the uprising in Paris, and a reputation for acting quickly and decisively. From the first days of command, Bonaparte showed that he was not going to work within the framework of established patterns. He immediately made personnel changes, brought order to the headquarters, organized at least some supplies, and most importantly, addressed the soldiers with a speech in which he did not talk about duty or homeland. He spoke of glory, victory, booty, and the fertile lands of Italy that awaited them ahead. These words had an effect. The exhausted soldiers suddenly felt that in front of them stood not just a commander, but a man ready to lead them forward to victory and a better life. Already in April, the offensive began. Bonaparte's strategy was strikingly different from what was usual at that time. He did not delay preparations, did not wait for reinforcements, but struck first and quickly. The opponents, the Austrians and Sardinians, did not have time to react. He consistently defeated them separately, breaking the lines of communication and forcing battle on areas convenient for him. A few weeks later, the Piemontese king asked for peace, removing Sardinia from the war. This was the first major success. Then followed a series of battles, each of which became a new stage of his glory. The Battle of Lodi strengthened the army's faith in their general. The enemy occupied positions behind the Adda River, and the path to him lay across a narrow bridge shot through by Austrian artillery. Despite the risk, Bonaparte ordered an assault. He personally led the grenadiers into the attack, and his bravery inspired the soldiers. The bridge was taken, the enemy thrown back. Napoleon would later admit that it was Lodi that made him feel he could influence not only the battle, but also the course of history. The Battle of Arcole was a test of endurance and willpower. The terrain was marshy, and the connections between the battalions were severed. The artillery had to be dragged by hand through the mud. Nevertheless, Bonaparte managed to rally the army and lead it forward, once again personally participating in the attack. At a critical moment, he grabbed the banner and rushed forward across the bridge under fire. He was almost killed. He ended up in the river, but his soldiers followed him. The enemy retreated. Victory was achieved not by numbers, but by character. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Rivoli. The Austrians attempted to break through the siege of Mantua and threw in significant forces. The French, inferior in numbers, skillfully used the terrain, occupied the commanding heights, and attacked from the flanks. The battle lasted 2 days. Result: defeat of the Austrian army, thousands of prisoners, captured cannons and banners. Mantua soon capitulated. Italy was under French control. However, victories on the battlefield were only part of the plan. Bonaparte began to build a new political architecture for the region. Sister republics were created in the conquered lands, the Cisalpine, Ligurian, and Roman. Formally independent states inspired by the ideals of freedom and equality, but in fact, puppets of France supplying it with recruits, money, and food. The army was fed and clothed at the expense of these lands. In parallel, valuables were exported: paintings, sculptures, books, coins. Trophies from Italian museums and monasteries were sent to Paris to decorate the future Louvre. All this was presented as the liberation of art, but was perceived by many as systematic plunder. After the fall of Mantua and a series of defeats, Austria was on the brink. Bonaparte moved towards Vienna, but Paris, worried about his growing influence, ordered a halt. Negotiations began. In October 1797, peace was signed at Campo Formio. Austria recognized all of France's conquests in Italy and ceded territory on the Rhine. For the first time since the beginning of the Revolutionary Wars, the French Republic had achieved a complete and formal victory. Bonaparte returned to France in triumph. His name was known even to those who had no interest in politics. He became the hero of the Republic, the symbol of a new era, and a man whose will and determination proved stronger than the old empires. But a new idea was already forming in his mind, the idea of an expedition unlike any before. And the place where he wanted to leave his mark was not Europe, but Egypt. In the spring of 1798, the name of Napoleon Bonaparte thundered throughout France. He was a war hero, the liberator of Italy, the creator of republics, the general who never lost. However, fame is a two-way street. The higher he rose in the eyes of the people, the more suspicion he aroused among those who still held power. The Directory, which formerly ruled France, was afraid of someone who could no longer be controlled. They saw him as a potential usurper and, at the same time, understood that he could not be eliminated without risk to themselves. The people loved him. The army trusted him. The decision turned out to be subtle. Bonaparte was offered to lead an expedition, neither in France nor in Europe, but far away in Egypt. There, not only would he not be able to threaten the authorities, but he might also solve an important foreign policy problem. France could not invade England directly. The fleet was weaker, and a direct clash would have resulted in defeat. However, it was possible to strike at British interests in India. Egypt, although formerly considered a province of the Ottoman Empire, occupied a strategic position between Europe and India. Control over it meant control over the eastern route of the British Empire. Bonaparte accepted the offer immediately. He saw this as a chance to go beyond the European theater and establish himself not only as a military leader, but also as a statesman, the creator of a new civilization. He dreamed of Eastern glory, of the exploits of Alexander the Great, whose example he had admired since his youth. He was going not just to fight, but also to bring the light of reason to lands immersed in darkness. In May 1798, a colossal fleet left Toulon. More than 100 ships carried 35,000 soldiers and officers, thousands of horses, cannons, and, importantly, 167 scientists, mathematicians, astronomers, architects, geologists, and linguists. This was not just an army. It was an expedition of the Enlightenment. It included people who would later become the founders of Egyptology. Bonaparte created the Institute of Egypt, and the expedition carried printing houses, microscopes, instruments, and field laboratories. The first target was Malta, an island controlled by the Order of the Johannites. Bonaparte easily forced the knights to capitulate. He carried out a quick reform of the government, abolished the old order, disarmed the clergy, took supplies, and, a week later, sailed on to Egypt. Malta became a prologue, an easy victory before the real test. Egypt met the French differently. Heat, sand, insects, diseases, lack of water, and constant tension among the local population. All this immediately turned the expedition into a tough campaign. On July 1st, the army was at Alexandria. The city was taken quickly, but then the route lay south through the desert to Cairo. Bonaparte led the army along the Nile, hoping to use the water as a source of life and a means of logistics. A few weeks later, the army approached the village of Embahut, and then to the place that would go down in history as the battlefield of the pyramids. The Mamluks, a military caste that controlled Egypt on behalf of the Ottoman Empire, gathered significant forces: cavalry, arquebusiers, and artillery. There were more than 20,000 of them. Napoleon ordered the troops to be built in carrés, closed rectangles of infantry with cannons at the corners, capable of repelling attacks from any side. Before the battle began, he uttered a phrase that would be remembered for centuries. 40 centuries are looking at you from the top of these pyramids. This was not just a gesture for the public. He knew how to inspire, and the soldiers moved forward with the feeling that they were part of something bigger. The battle lasted for several hours. The Mamluks attacked in waves, but the carrés remained unshaken. The artillery mowed down the horsemen. The infantry held the line. At the end of the day, the field was littered with bodies. The French were victorious. The road to Cairo was open. Cairo surrendered a few days later. Bonaparte entered the city as a liberator. He addressed the locals, trying to speak the language of Islam, calling himself a friend of the Muslims and an enemy of the Mamluks. He issued declarations in which he said that he had come not to conquer, but to save. However, the population treated the French with distrust. They did not understand the foreign religion, did not recognize the foreign commander, and almost immediately tension began, and soon, an uprising. Meanwhile, a catastrophe was unfolding in the Mediterranean. The British fleet, under the command of Horatio Nelson, discovered the French ships anchored in Aboukir Bay. On August 1st, 1798, a battle began that lasted all night. Nelson attacked unexpectedly. He came between the French fleet and the shore, violating all maritime regulations, and routed the enemy. Almost the entire French fleet was destroyed or captured. The army in Egypt was cut off. There was no longer any communication with France. The expedition was in danger of becoming a trap. In these circumstances, Bonaparte showed no panic, but stubborn activity. He tried to strengthen his position on the ground, began to create new administrative bodies, built fortifications, introduced laws, and prohibited robberies. He founded the Institute of Egypt, a scientific institution where research was conducted in the fields of geography, botany, and architecture. It was during this period that the Rosetta Stone was discovered, a slab with a trilingual inscription that would later make it possible to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs. This find would become the greatest contribution of the expedition to science. But against the backdrop of scientific discoveries, another darker life was going on. A rebellion broke out in Cairo. The streets were filled with people with knives and pikes. French patrols were cut out. Warehouses were set on fire. Bonaparte ordered the rebellion to be suppressed violently. Artillery fired at entire neighborhoods. Suspects of conspiracy were shot without trial. The repressions were merciless, but they temporarily restored order. In early 1799, Napoleon decided to take the war to enemy territory. He headed to Syria to defeat the Turkish forces before they invaded Egypt. The French army besieged Jaffa, took it with heavy losses, and moved on to the city of Acre. There, at the walls of the ancient city, the French were stuck in the fortress. Acre was defended by a Turkish garrison, supported by the British fleet. The assaults followed one after another. Diseases spread among the soldiers. There was a shortage of water, gunpowder, and engineering equipment. The siege failed. Bonaparte was forced to retreat for the first time in his life. He returned to Egypt with the knowledge that victory was slipping away. He felt that his presence there was no longer beneficial to France, and the situation inside the country was getting worse. Paris was shaking with scandals. The government lacked authority, and the Directory was losing control. And then Napoleon made a decision. He secretly left Egypt, leaving the army under the command of General Kleber. He boarded a small ship. In September 1799, he set off for home. The journey was risky. The British fleet patrolled the Mediterranean, but the ship managed to get through. In October, Bonaparte set foot on French soil. In Paris, no one knew for sure whether he was alive or dead. His return was sudden, almost mystical. He left behind an army in the desert. Ahead of him was a country tired of chaos. He did not return as the commander of an expedition. He returned as a man ready to take power. In the autumn of 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte returned from Egypt to the country he had left as a completely different person. During his absence for a year and a half, France had plunged into a political and economic crisis. The war with the coalition continued with varying success. There was a shortage of people and resources at the front, and chaos within. The people were tired of revolutionary slogans, terror and disorder, and most importantly, of the weakness of power. The Directory, a collegial body of 5 people that formally governed the Republic, did not inspire confidence. Constant scandals, corruption, intrigue, and inefficiency were destroying the remnants of authority. The generals acted almost independently. The provinces lived in their own way, and in the capital, there was an atmosphere of expectation of change. Everyone felt that the old order was collapsing, but no one knew what would replace it. It was at this moment that a figure appeared whom the public had not yet forgotten. The man who had won victories in Italy and at the pyramids. The hero of the Republic, the commander who was compared to Caesar. His return was greeted with enthusiasm. Crowds gathered to see his carriage. Newspapers wrote about him as a savior. Maneuvering began in political circles. Some wanted to use him as a sword. Others hoped to direct his ambitions. But Bonaparte was no longer the young general who went to Italy for glory. He had become a man confident in his historical mission. Key figures were involved in the conspiracy. His brother Lucien Bonaparte, president of the Council of 500, the organizing politician of the coup who sought to reform the Republic, and the Minister of War, Roger Ducos. Their plan was simple: using public discontent and the influence of the army to carry out a peaceful coup d'etat under the pretext of defending the Constitution. November the 9th, 1799. According to the revolutionary calendar, it was 18 Brumaire of the 8th year. The deputies of the legislative assemblies were gathered in the residence in Saint-Cloud, far from the restless Paris. There they were informed that a conspiracy was being prepared against the Republic, and for their safety, the vote had to be held far from the capital. Everything looked legal, but behind the facade of anxiety, there was a precise calculation. Napoleon arrived in Saint-Cloud, accompanied by grenadiers. He entered the halls where the sessions were taking place and tried to make a speech, vague, unconvincing, and incoherent. The deputies expected explanations, but instead of clear arguments, they heard accusations and threats. The noise grew louder. The Council of 500 began to shout, "Outlaw dictatorship!" The atmosphere became threatening. One of the deputies tried to attack Bonaparte. He was dragged out of the hall under guard. The situation hung by a thread, and then Lucien came on stage. He climbed onto the platform, drew his sword, raised it, and exclaimed that his brother was not a conspirator, but the savior of the Republic, and that he was ready to run him through with his own weapon if Napoleon gave him freedom. It was a gesture calculated for effect. The soldiers standing outside were brought into the hall and forced out the deputies. Power was taken without bloodshed, but not without threats. The next day, a new form of government, the consulate, was announced. Formally, this was the restoration of order. A government of 3 consuls was established, with Bonaparte listed as first among equals. However, from the very first days, it became clear that there would be no equality. The others, Sieyès and Ducos, became secondary figures. All important decisions were made by Napoleon. He rejected revolutionary parliamentarism, dissolved the Council of 500, replaced it with a more manageable Senate, restored control over the army, and began a large-scale reform of the administrative system. France was being rebuilt not in the direction of anarchy, but in the direction of centralization. The people, tired of disorder, accepted this without resistance. Moreover, many perceived the arrival of Bonaparte as deliverance from chaos. Newspapers wrote about him as a man capable of ending the revolution. His image combined the memory of the Republican struggle, military glory, and the promise of order. He did not cancel the gains of the revolution, preserved the civil code, freedom of conscience, and educational reform. But under his control, the old freedoms were disappearing. It was no longer a question of popular sovereignty. It was a question of stability, discipline, and the greatness of the state. Formally, he remained the first consul, but, in fact, he became the ruler of France. Laws were made in his offices. His signature opened the appointments. His will shaped fate. Thus ended the era of revolutionary disorder, and a new chapter began, the era of the power of one man. He had not yet taken the crown, but he already held the country in his hands. The first years after the coup of the 18th Brumaire became a time for France that seemed almost unbelievable after 10 years of revolutions, terror, civil war, and political experiments. For the first time in a long time, the country felt order. A man was in power who was capable of acting quickly and harshly, imposing discipline not only on the army, but also on state institutions. Napoleon concentrated his efforts on restoring governance. He reformed the administration, established a strict vertical of power, introduced the positions of prefects in the departments, and restored funding for the judicial system. In 1800, the Bank of France was created, which helped stabilize the financial situation. Taxes were unified, uniform measures of weight and length were introduced, and the first major codifications of law were carried out. Everything in his actions was subject to logic. Order, efficiency, centralized control. He did not cancel the gains of the revolution. On the contrary, he consolidated them, but turned them into elements of a new, rational system. Freedom of religion, secular schools, the destruction of feudal privileges, and equality before the law were preserved, but now, not as ideals, but as structural elements of statehood. It was no longer a question of popular sovereignty. It was a question of a strong government, capable of keeping the country from falling apart. In 1802, when the people had already gotten used to the new order, a plebiscite was held. The question was clearly posed: should Napoleon Bonaparte be appointed consul for life? The official results were almost unanimous. The result of the plebiscite surprised few people and did not even matter. The real essence was different. France no longer resisted personal power. On the contrary, it wanted it. Against this background, the idea of restoring the monarchy, but in a new form, ceased to seem crony. Bonaparte did not intend to become the king of France. This would have been a return to the past against which he had fought. He wanted something else: a new title, a new image, a new system. France did not need a dynasty, but a founder. And in 1804, such a decision was made. Napoleon would become the Emperor of the French. While preparations were underway in the shadow of great events, a personal history continued, which began long before the coronation. The story of his wife, Josephine de Beauharnais, the woman who was by his side from the very beginning. She was 6 years older than him, came from Martinique, survived the death of her first husband on a guillotine, raised 2 children, and was highly respected in Parisian society. When they met in 1795, she was already considered a socialite, intelligent, subtle, and influential. Napoleon fell in love quickly and unconditionally. His letters, full of delight and longing, speak of a man who, despite his outward coldness, experienced truly deep feelings. They married in the spring of 1796, literally a few days before his departure for Italy. It was an impulsive marriage. He was looking for love, she for protection. And although the relationship was full of jealousy, resentment, and quarrels from the very beginning, they remained together. Josephine accompanied him in public life, was there during ups and downs, had the ability to smooth out rough edges, and win over even his most ardent opponents. Having become the first consul, Napoleon not only did not distance himself from her, he strengthened her position. Despite the absence of children in their marriage, despite the rumors and reproaches, he continued to keep her close. And when the moment of the coronation came, he decided that she should be part of this event. He could have placed the crown on himself alone, but he chose a symbol that not everyone understood, but everyone saw. On December 2nd, 1804, a ceremony took place in Notre Dame Cathedral that surpassed everything Paris had seen in terms of scale and spectacle since the time of the Bourbons. Politicians, diplomats, generals, scientists, and artists gathered under the vaults of the Gothic temple. In the center of the altar sat Pope Pius VII, invited in person to give the event religious legitimacy. But Napoleon reserved the key decision for himself. When the moment of the coronation arrived, he did not allow the Pope to crown him. He walked up to the altar, took the crown in his hands, and placed it on his own head. The gesture was premeditated. He did not want to seem beholden to either the church or tradition. He wanted to show that power emanated from himself. Then he turned to Josephine, who stood next to him, and with the same solemn calm, placed the Empress's crown on her head. This was not only a private confession, it was a public confirmation of her place in the new state. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite the absence of an heir, he made her part of the ritual of power. The coronation ended with a solemn choir, fanfares, and prayer. As they left the cathedral, Paris saw a new form of power. Not a king by right of birth, but an emperor by right of action, a man who did not inherit the throne, but built it. After this, France officially became an empire. The old institutions were renamed. The army became imperial. The minister of the interior became a great officer of the empire. The senators became the pillars of the new regime. Everything that had previously been created by the revolution was now formalized according to a single model: subordination to the center, efficiency, structure. Bonaparte's empire was not a continuation of the old order, like the Bourbons, but it was not a revolution either. It was the third state, a system in which the law became an instrument of will and order, a form of legitimacy. Everything that had recently seemed wild or impossible, coronations, titles, regalia, now seemed natural. The people accepted this power because it brought results. Europe was still hesitating, but France was already following the man it had raised to the top. France entered 1805 in a completely new status. Its ruler, the recently crowned emperor, had concentrated in his hands not only symbolic power, but also the real mechanisms of governance within the country: stability, a centralized system, reforms, a loyal army, and a vibrant economy. Outwardly, an alarming silence, but behind this silence hid a growing threat. Napoleon's coronation was perceived by the monarchies of Europe as a challenge. It was received especially painfully in London, St. Petersburg, and Vienna, the capitals of powers that had previously been unable to come to terms with the successes of the French Revolution. Now, they had to deal not with a revolutionary republic, chaotic and unpredictable, but with a powerful and stable empire. It seemed that the very idea of legitimacy had changed its appearance, from divine anointing to the will of the people and military genius. For traditional monarchs, this was not just alarming, it was dangerous. First of all, Great Britain, the only European power that had never made peace with revolutionary France for a long time, went into resistance. After a short truce in Amiens, broken literally a year later, it resumed the blockade of French ports, activated its spy network, and began to prepare a new coalition. Austria soon joined it, seeking to regain its lost territories and revenge for the humiliation in Italy. Russia, under the leadership of the young Emperor Alexander I, also expressed its readiness to participate in the European alliance. And although each side had different motives, they were united by a common goal: to prevent Napoleon from establishing himself as the new ruler of the continent. The formation of the Third Anti-French Coalition occurred rapidly. England took on financial support. The Austrians were preparing an army, concentrating it in Bavaria. Russia promised to contribute more than 100,000 troops, who were to join the Allies in Central Europe. Prussia, although hesitant, remained neutral, waiting to see which side would win. Napoleon watched events closely. He knew that if he delayed, France would be surrounded. The army previously assembled on the Channel coast for the invasion of England was in camp near Boulogne. But when it became clear that a land war was inevitable, he abandoned his ambitions for a naval invasion and concentrated all his attention on Germany. The speed with which he rebuilt his strategy astonished even the most experienced generals. In a matter of weeks, he organized the army's passage across the Rhine. More than 200,000 men, united into the Grande Armée, moved along a carefully calculated route, avoiding clashes until a decisive advantage was achieved. The main objective was to defeat the Austrian army before the Russian troops arrived. The Austrian commander, General Karl Mack, concentrated his main forces near the city of Ulm in the hope that the French would not manage to arrive quickly enough. He counted on holding the position and waiting for the Allies. But Napoleon undertook a completely different operation. Instead of a frontal attack, he launched a series of maneuvers, outflanked the Austrians from the north, crossed the Danube, and closed the encirclement. Ulm was trapped. Austrian units tried to break out, but they were intercepted. On October 20th, 1805, after several days of unsuccessful attempts to break through, General Mack capitulated. More than 25,000 soldiers surrendered. The victory was achieved without a major battle thanks to the speed, precision of calculation, and coordination of the columns. After Ulm, the road to Vienna was open. Napoleon entered the Austrian capital in November, but the war was not over. The main forces of the Allies, the Russian army under the command of Kutuzov and Alexander I, as well as the remnants of the Austrians, were retreating to Moravia. Napoleon understood that his army was exhausted, his rear was stretched, and the longer the war dragged on, the higher the risk of Prussian intervention or a new uprising in the rear. He had to deliver one decisive blow. By choosing the plateau near the city of Austerlitz as the site of the clash, he provoked the Allies into battle. To achieve the desired scenario, Napoleon resorted to subtle military play. He demonstratively weakened the right flank, withdrew part of the troops, and created the impression that the French were unable to hold their position. It was a trap. On the morning of December 2nd, 1805, exactly on the anniversary of his coronation, the battle began. The morning fog hid the movements of the troops. The Russian-Austrian army began an offensive on the French right flank, exactly where Napoleon wanted. When their main forces got bogged down in the offensive, he suddenly attacked the center. The French corps broke into the Pratzen Heights, splitting the Allied army in two. From that moment on, the battle took on a swift and inexorable course. The Allied center forces were surrounded and scattered, and the flanks were demoralized. Artillery pounded the retreating units. At the ponds near the village of Satzen, the Allied troops tried to cross on thin ice, which began to crack under the roar of the cannons. Hundreds of soldiers went underwater. Equipment sank. Order fell apart. By evening, everything had been decided. The Allies had lost over 30,000 men killed, wounded, and captured. The French losses were 3 times less. Alexander I hastily retreated, shocked and disappointed. Franz I, finding himself alone, asked for peace. The Treaty of Pressburg, signed in December, secured the political consequences of the victory. Austria left the coalition, renounced its claims to Italy and Germany, paid a contribution, and ceded significant territories. France had finally established itself as the main force in Europe. But Napoleon did not limit himself to peace. He decided to change the map of Germany. Already the following year, the Rhine Union, an association of 16 German principalities that had left the Holy Roman Empire, was created under the French protectorate. This was the de facto end of the empire that had existed for almost 1,000 years. Franz was the first to renounce the title of Emperor of the Germans. The old order, based on vassal loyalty, was destroyed. From that moment on, the map of Europe was no longer subject to the old borders. Now it was drawn in the headquarters of the French army, approved by decrees from the Tuileries, and sealed with seals on treaties dictated by the vanquished. The Battle of Austerlitz was not just a military victory. It confirmed the image of Napoleon as a man who was capable of rebuilding the world, not only with the sword, but also with political calculation. His empire no longer seemed like a temporary anomaly. It became the new norm. For some, an object of admiration. For others, an object of fear. After the defeat of the Third Coalition, after Austerlitz, and the creation of the Rhine Union, France entered a new phase of its existence. A phase of strengthening and institutionalizing power. Victory in the war gave the empire political superiority. But it was important to Napoleon that his power felt solid not only on the battlefield, but also in the daily lives of millions of people. At this time, the empire had reached the highest point of internal stability. All the key mechanisms of the state were in operation. The army remained combat ready, finances stable, the people generally loyal. But behind this external calm, painstaking work was underway to transform the revolutionary chaos into a centralized hierarchy subordinated to one will. The main instrument of this transformation was the administrative reforms that had begun during the consulate, but received their final form under the empire. France was divided into departments, each headed by a prefect appointed from Paris. The prefects were not elected, did not report to local elites, but directly carried out the will of the central government. They controlled the collection of taxes, supervision of schools, police, construction, and public order. Under them were subprefects, mayors, and councillors, also not elected, but appointed. The democratic elements that the revolution still tried to preserve were finally abolished. Power no longer came from below. It came down from above, clearly, consistently, without the right to discuss. This new structure required a single legal foundation. And here the Napoleonic Code comes to the fore, one of the most significant projects in the history of Western jurisprudence. Work on it began during the consulate, but it was published in 1804, and in the following years, it received dozens of additions and clarifications. It was not just a collection of laws, it was a political statement. The code enshrined the principles of equality before the law, the inviolability of property, freedom of contract, civil marriage, and civil liability. It eliminated class differences, abolished birth privileges, and systematized judicial practice. The man received leadership in the family and the state control over civil affairs. The woman, according to the code, was subordinate to her husband. Divorces were limited, paternal power became absolute. From the point of view of lawyers, this was a giant step forward. From the point of view of politicians, it was an instrument of legitimization. After all, now the empire had an official legal basis, understandable, rational, and the same, from Lille to Marseille. The code was exported to dependent states, to Italy, to Belgium, to the Rhine Union. It became a symbol of the French model of civilization, secular, centralized, legally formalized. But Napoleon understood that stability is impossible without symbols. He needed to create a new elite to replace the burned and exiled aristocratic class of the old regime. And so, in 1808, he established the imperial nobility. This was not a return to the nobility by blood. It was the formation of a nobility by merit. The new counts, barons, vicars, and dukes were generals, judges, administrators, scientists, and officials who had served the state faithfully and truly. They were awarded lands, titles, sometimes pensions, but most importantly, they received a place in the new vertical, in the hierarchy, where everyone knew their position and their duties. Symbols of this new aristocracy were established: coats of arms, seals, robes, official receptions. The imperial court became a full-fledged copy of the royal one, but without dynastic clans, without family exclusivity. The legend that every soldier carried a marshal's baton in his backpack was now continued in the form of titles and awards. At the same time, state propaganda flourished. Artists painted Napoleon not as a politician, but as an ancient hero. Writers compared him to Caesar and Alexander. School textbooks spoke of him as the savior of the nation. Coins were minted with his profile. Portraits of the emperor were hung in city halls and courts. All this formed an image. The power in the country was not only effective, but also infallible. During this period, schools and lyceums were built in France, subordinate to the state and its ideology. Education became an instrument for educating citizens of the empire, teaching history, literature, and law. Everything was oriented toward developing loyalty to the system, discipline, and respect for order. Universities came under the control of ministries. Engineering schools appeared that trained administrators, military men, and technocrats. More and more young people began their careers not through the church or family connections, but through service. Thus, by 1807, the empire was a single, well-oiled machine. Its economy was growing, trade was developing, the financial system was under control, the provinces were governed quickly and strictly. The army had a clear recruitment system, constant training, and an aura of heroism. At the head stood a man to whom you did not address your majesty, but said, "Sovereign Emperor." And yet behind this visible order, there was an inner, tense rhythm. The entire system was based on the personal energy and control of one man. He did not delegate. He signed hundreds of decrees a day. He interfered in court cases, architectural projects, school textbooks, and complaints about bread. Everything went through him, and this gave a sense of power, but also made the system vulnerable. The looming new coalition, the economic struggle with England, the growing ambitions beyond Europe, all this was already approaching. But for now, the empire was at its peak, and it seemed that it could last forever. By 1806, Napoleon's empire had reached the peak of its power. The military machine was honed. The laws worked. France controlled not only its original borders, but also a significant part of Central Europe, the Netherlands, Northern Italy, Switzerland, and the Rhine Union. In the eyes of Europe, it was no longer just a victorious state, but a new tempestuous reality with which it was necessary to either come to terms or enter into a final struggle. But not everyone decided to come to terms. Against the backdrop of the peaceful splendor of Paris and the orderly life of the French prefectures in Berlin, Vienna, and St. Petersburg, tensions were brewing again. The situation was particularly alarming in Prussia, a state which had remained neutral until now, but watched with increasing irritation as French influence spread along the Rhine, approaching its own borders. King Frederick III, indecisive and slow by nature, hesitated for a long time, but his entourage, especially the military and court nationalists, increasingly pushed him to action. Prussia had not participated in the Third Coalition, and now, in the opinion of its politicians, had the moral right to even out the balance. Napoleon's entry into the Berlin sphere of influence was especially painful. The decisive impetus was a personal insult. In August 1806, Napoleon, without the consent of Berlin, annexed the Principality of Kleveberg and offered it to his brother Joachim Murat. This was perceived as a slap in the face. In October, Prussia declared war. Its army, which had never fought in a modern campaign, set out on the campaign, confident in its glorious tradition from the time of Frederick II. However, this confidence was based more on memory than reality. Napoleon, without waiting for the enemy to take the initiative, led the Grande Armée north. His strategy was the same: a quick march, a sudden concentration, a blow from the rear. By mid-October, the French corps began to close in on the main Prussian forces, concentrated in the area of the cities of Jena and Auerstedt. On October 14, 1806, two battles took place near these two cities. In history, they are often called Jena-Auerstedt. In fact, these were two different battles, fought simultaneously. Napoleon personally commanded the army of Jena. His opponent was the Duke of Brunswick, an elderly and indecisive man whose actions were characterized by slowness and uncertainty. The French attacked at dawn, and the battle was fought with varying success throughout the day. But by midday, the emperor brought in reserves, and the Prussian line was broken. A retreat began, which turned into a rout. At the same time, in the Auerstedt area, Marshal Davout, with only 26,000 men at his disposal, met a Prussian army of more than 60,000. It seemed that he had no chance, but discipline, artillery fire, and the tenacity of the French infantry ensured an incredible victory. The Prussian army wavered and retreated, abandoning the battlefield to Davout, to whom Napoleon later rightly awarded the title of Duke of Auerstedt. By evening, it became clear that Prussia had been defeated in just one day. Napoleon moved on. He soon entered Berlin, where he spent several weeks establishing a new order. Arsenals were confiscated, bridges and roads were taken under control. French soldiers occupied barracks, museums, and palaces. The city, once the center of the Prussian spirit, was now transformed into a transit base for new campaigns. But Napoleon did not limit himself to military measures. It was in Berlin that he adopted one of his most important political and economic acts, the Berlin Decree, signed at the end of October 1806. The essence of the decree was as follows. France declared Great Britain to be in a state of complete economic blockade. All ports controlled by the Empire and its allies were closed to British ships. Trade with England was outlawed. Control over correspondence, goods, and ships was introduced. English goods were subject to confiscation, and ships were subject to arrest. Even neutral countries were ordered to choose, either trade with France or with London. This was the beginning of the so-called Continental Blockade, a massive economic campaign aimed at strangling Great Britain. Napoleon could not defeat it at sea, but he hoped to destroy its trading empire by cutting off access to European markets. In words, the system looked powerful and ruthless. In practice, it required colossal effort, the creation of a customs service, coastal surveillance, monitoring merchants and diplomats, sanctions, confiscations, and reprisals against violators. Some countries resisted. Some, like Russia, formally agreed, but violated the ban through neutral intermediaries. Smuggling flourished. Yet the gesture itself carried enormous symbolic weight. Napoleon was challenging not an army, but a trade network, not a state, but the global economy. While the blockade began to take effect, the emperor continued his offensive. The remnants of the Prussian army retreated east toward the borders of Poland. Russian troops were already approaching. The war with Prussia was quietly transforming into a war with Russia. A new stage of the struggle was beginning, one even more difficult and bloody. But for now, France stood firm in Berlin. The empire was at its peak. Behind Napoleon were Austerlitz, Jena, and Berlin. Ahead lay snow, mud, and the first hints that the geography of Europe would resist no less than its armies. By the winter of 1806, France found itself in the very heart of Northern Europe. Prussia lay defeated. Its capital was occupied, its army was defeated, its king was on the run. But Napoleon's triumph was incomplete. The main rival, for whom the Fourth Coalition had been assembled, had not yet entered the battle. Russia, driven by Alexander I's desire to stop the spread of the Napoleonic system, continued to concentrate troops to the east, on the territories that had previously belonged to Poland. The winter campaign promised to be difficult. Napoleon's army, exhausted after Jena and the march through Saxony, entered a region where the climate and logistics dictated their own conditions that were unusual for the French. However, the emperor was not going to wait for spring. He sought to strike before the Russians finally strengthened their positions. By the beginning of 1807, the French had advanced to the northeast. In January, the first major clash took place, the Battle of Jaunsburg, where Marshal Bennigsen, who commanded the Russian troops, managed to retreat with organized forces. Napoleon tried to intercept him and force a decisive battle, but the Russian army slipped away. In February, it consolidated itself at Preußisch Eylau, a small town in eastern Prussia, surrounded by fields covered with snow and ice. The Battle of Preußisch Eylau, which took place from the 7th to the 8th of February 1807, was one of the most terrible in Napoleon's career. It began in conditions when snow and blizzards hid the movement of troops, artillery sank in snowdrifts, and people had difficulty finding their way around. More than 100,000 soldiers were involved on both sides. The French were confronted not only by Russian corps, but also by fierce weather. The first day of the battle was chaotic. The French tried to break through the center of the Russian position, but encountered stubborn resistance. Artillery fire was ineffective. Cannonballs sank in the snow. Cavalry attacks were ineffective. Battles were fought for every village, for every farmstead. By evening, Napoleon realized that he could not achieve a turning point. At night, the temperature dropped even lower. Soldiers slept on the ground, huddled together. Some froze to death. In the morning, the French army was exhausted. But unexpectedly, the corps of Marshal Davout arrived on the field from the south. Its appearance allowed the second wave of the offensive to be launched. However, despite the enormous efforts, the Russian army was not routed. It retreated in order, leaving the field but retaining its fighting capacity. The losses were monstrous. More than 20,000 killed, wounded, and missing on each side. The snow turned black and crimson. Even Napoleon, who always tried to emphasize the greatness of the victory, this time avoided solemn statements. This was the first battle that he did not win unconditionally, and perhaps the first in which he truly understood that the war in the East would be different. In the spring of 1807, hostilities resumed. The Russian army again occupied fortified positions. The French advanced with difficulty. The roads were washed out, supplies were unstable, the soldiers were tired, and diseases began. But Napoleon, despite these difficulties, did not lose the initiative. He understood that if he could defeat the Russians before other powers, such as Prussia or Sweden, intervened, it would be possible not only to end the campaign, but also to reshape Eastern Europe. The culmination was the Battle of Friedland, which took place on June 14, 1807. Here, the Russians, confident in their numbers and fighting spirit, decided to attack themselves. Bennigsen wanted to seize the initiative, but made a strategic mistake. He positioned the army with the river at its back, which, if unsuccessful, threatened disaster. Napoleon immediately understood the vulnerability of the enemy's position. He gave battle on the terms that he himself had created. The French artillery methodically fired at the Russian positions. The infantry advanced in waves. The cavalry cut off the escape routes. In the afternoon, the army of Bennigsen began to retreat to the bridges over the Alle River. A crush began. The wooden crossings could not withstand. The water carried away bodies, carts, horses. The Russians lost more than 20,000 people. The French suffered less damage, but their success was achieved at the cost of great effort. Nevertheless, Friedland was a complete victory. Following it, the last hopes of the coalition collapsed. Alexander I, realizing that continuing the war could lead to disaster, agreed to negotiations. An unusual meeting place was chosen, the city of Tilsit, on the border of Russia and Prussia, through which the Neman River flowed. In the middle of the river, a floating platform was built, on which a pavilion was erected, designed as a neutral zone. Napoleon and Alexander met in person. Little is known about their conversation, but eyewitnesses said that mutual respect and perhaps even sympathy quickly developed between them. Alexander, the charming young French-speaking emperor, made an impression. Napoleon, confident, calculating, self-made, was admired. The meeting resulted in the Tilsit Treaties, signed in July 1807. Russia was leaving the war, effectively becoming an ally of France. Alexander agreed to join the Continental blockade, ceasing trade with Great Britain. In return, France promised not to interfere in Russia's internal affairs and to recognize its interests in the East. For Prussia, the treaty was devastating. It was losing almost half of its territory, including Polish lands, on which Napoleon created the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, a bridgehead state, formally independent, but completely controlled by Paris. Prussia was turning into King Friedrich Wilhelm was forced to humiliatingly wait his turn to meet the Emperor of France. After Tilsit, Napoleon controlled almost all of continental Europe. From the Atlantic to the Vistula, from Hamburg to Naples, the French language was spoken. The Napoleonic Code d'E was in force. Trains with French weapons and officials were running. He had achieved what seemed impossible. He had divided Europe with Russia, pushing back all the old borders and imposing a new geopolitics on the world. But behind all this grandeur, there were already disturbing shadows. The blockade of England was not working perfectly. Smuggling was growing. Popular discontent was brewing in Spain, and Alexander, although he had signed an alliance, was not going to submit to Paris forever. But for now, the empire was triumphant. soldiers marched to the sound of trumpets. Trains left for the west, carrying gold and grain. Europe froze for a moment with the feeling that everything had already been decided, that history had ended, but was only just beginning. After the triumph at Tilsit, Napoleon's empire seemed unshakable. In the east, peace with Russia. In the north, suppressed Prussia. In the south, allied Italy. Only one enemy continued to slip away: Great Britain, an island power that could not be broken by blockade, navy, or diplomacy. It was precisely in order to strangle England economically that Napoleon continued to push through the continental blockade. He demanded that all European countries, even neutral and allied ones, cease all trade relations with London. But there was one country that formally followed the rules but, in fact, turned a blind eye to smuggling: Portugal. The Portuguese royal family, closely allied with the British, did not want to break off trade with them, and Napoleon decided to force them into obedience. To do this, it was necessary to go through Spain, a formally allied country, but ruled by the aging King Charles IV and his unpopular favorite Godoy. At first, French troops entered Spanish territory under the pretext of a joint expedition against Portugal. But the situation changed very quickly. Instead of a limited invasion, Napoleon began systematically occupying key Spanish cities. He acted with increasing confidence, as if Spain were not an ally, but a future province. In France and Paris, these steps were perceived as another move toward the creation of a pan-continental empire. But in Spain itself, everything looked different. The people felt humiliated, the aristocracy was alarmed, and the military was perplexed. Everything was complicated by the fact that a conflict had broken out within the Spanish dynasty itself between Charles IV and his son Prince Ferdinand. Napoleon, seeking to take advantage of this situation, summoned both to Bayonne, a French city near the border. There, in an atmosphere of pressure and threats, he forced Charles IV to abdicate. His son, who had already declared himself king, was also deprived of power. The Spanish throne was vacant. Napoleon offered it to his brother Joseph Bonaparte, who had previously ruled Naples. Thus, France theoretically received another allied monarchy, but in practice, it opened the gates to the most destructive war of the entire empire. Joseph's appointment did not inspire enthusiasm in Madrid. On the contrary, it became a spark. Arguments were also boiling inside the Russian headquarters. Barclay insisted on continuing the retreat. He believed that time was on Russia's side. Bagration and other generals demanded a battle, and under mounting pressure from the public and the army, Alexander appointed Mikhail Illarionovich Kutuzov commander-in-chief. Kutuzov was not a supporter of battles at any cost, but he knew that if he retreated from Moscow, the army would not be held, and he chose a place where he could meet the enemy near the village of Borodino. This point on the map, with rivers, hills, and open spaces, made it possible to build a line of defense. There were redoubts, forest edges, and plains for artillery, and most importantly, it lay on a direct road to Moscow. This was the last natural line of defense. Kutuzov began urgent preparations. They buried guns, built fortifications, and dug trenches. The center of defense was the Raevsky Redoubt. The flanks were covered by Bagration's flèches and Semyonov's positions. On September 7, 1812, the Battle of Preborodino took place. The French began the battle with a powerful artillery bombardment. In a few hours, the field was covered in smoke and dust. The attacks were on the right flank of the Russians, then on the center. The French lost thousands. Bagration was mortally wounded. The cavalry rushed around Popola. Napoleon did not dare to bring in the guard. Kutuzov retained most of the army until the end of the battle. The losses were terrible, 30 to 40,000 on each side. But Kutuzov's army was not routed. It retreated, preserving the core. Napoleon gained access to Moscow, but ahead of him lay a city he did not expect. Moscow was empty. The inhabitants had left. There were almost no supplies left in the city, and soon fires broke out, first in several blocks, then in dozens. The fire engulfed the city in a matter of days. Only ruins remained of wooden Moscow. It is believed that the fires were not accidental. Many buildings were deliberately set on fire. The governor was trampled, the fire brigades were killed, and he himself left the city. The troops had no food with them. The horses died of hunger. An epidemic began in the city. Napoleon, who lived in the Kremlin, waited for the delegation, waited for Alexander, waited for peace. But Alexander was silent. A month later, realizing that the army would not survive the winter in ruins, Napoleon ordered a retreat. The retreat was not a battle, but a dying. Snow covered the roads, the temperature dropped. Horses were killed to keep warm. Cossacks attacked convoys. Partisans set fire to bridges. Local residents hid bread, destroyed wells. People died in tens of thousands. Artillery was abandoned. The infantry died out. Officers rode horseback among empty regiments. On the Berezina in November, the remnants of the army tried to cross the river. Bridges were built under fire. People were drowning. Guns were sinking under the ice. It wasn't an army. These were the remnants of an idea, shadows of a once formidable corps, non-nonsense. Of 600,000 soldiers, less than 50,000 returned to Europe. The emperor was saved, but his empire began to perish. The catastrophe in Russia did not simply take hundreds of thousands of lives. It opened a window of opportunity for Europe that all of Napoleon's opponents had long been waiting for. Until 1812, France had proven invincible. Not one of the previous coalitions had been able to withstand the onslaught of the empire. But with the death of the Great Army, the very one that Napoleon had led across Europe to the gates of Moscow, the myth of his invincibility disappeared. In its place arose the feeling that he could now be crushed. When Napoleon, having secretly left the army, returned to Paris in December, he acted with the same determination. He convened a state council, assured everyone that the situation was under control, and began a new mobilization. France, exhausted, orphaned, and in mourning, received a new call-up. Young men, inexperienced, and often poorly trained, were called upon to replace the veterans. The mobilization received the ironic nickname of the Army of Bearded Youths. But Napoleon had no other choice. He knew that the coalition was preparing for a new war, and he sought to strike first. In the spring of 1813, the French army crossed the Rhine again. But this time, everything was different. It was not only Russia that opposed it. Now Prussia, which until recently had been a vassal power, forced to endure occupation and pay indemnities, joined Alexander I. Sweden also joined with the former French Marshal Bernadotte as its crown prince. He was now fighting against the one to whom he had once sworn allegiance. Austria, which had so far remained neutral, waited watching what was happening. The French army, hastily replenished with the assembled units, won several victories in Saxony, in particular at Lucen and Bautzen. But these were defensive victories. They did not lead to a strategic breakthrough, did not force the coalition to capitulate. The Allies temporarily requested an armistice, but during these negotiations, it became clear that the goals of the parties were incompatible. The coalition demanded that France return to the borders of 1791, give up the territories it controlled in Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands. Napoleon refused. For him, this was tantamount to the collapse of the empire. In the summer of 1813, the war resumed with renewed vigor. Now, Austria openly entered the game. Despite the dynastic union, because Marie-Louise, Napoleon's wife, was the daughter of the Austrian emperor, Vienna decided to go over to the side of the victors. France found itself surrounded. The Russians were advancing in the east, the Austrians in the south, and in the north and in Spain, the British under the command of the Duke of Wellington. In Germany itself, national resistance was increasingly evident. The Germans, previously submissive, were now rising up. Universities, student unions, and secret organizations were inspired by ideas of liberation from French oppression. Unrest broke out in the cities. The French garrisons increasingly felt like occupiers. By autumn, it became clear that a decisive clash was inevitable. It took place in October near Leipzig, a city located at the intersection of key roads and rivers. On one side, Napoleon's army, about 200,000 men, tired but still formidable. On the other, the forces of the Sixth Coalition, almost 350,000 soldiers, Russians, Austrians, Swedes, reserve corps from Saxony and Bavaria. The Battle of Leipzig lasted 4 days. The first day was limited. The French held their positions, but with each passing day, the Allies increased the pressure and brought up reserves. On the third day, a full-scale offensive began. Napoleon, not having sufficient forces to hold the front, ordered a retreat. On the night of October 19th, the crossing of the Elster River began. But by tragic accident, the bridge over the river was blown up too early. Thousands of soldiers were cut off from the main forces. They died, were captured, or drowned. Among the dead was Marshal Panitsky, the only Pole among the marshals of the empire. He fought to the end and drowned while trying to escape by swimming. The Battle of Leipzig, known as the Battle of the Nations, became the largest battle of that era. The losses on both sides exceeded 100,000 people, but most importantly, it became a turning point. After it, the French army retreated not just from the battlefield, it retreated from Central Europe. During the winter, Napoleon lost control of Germany, Bavaria, Saxony, the Westphalian lands, the Confederation of the Rhine. All the former allies were now going over to the coalition side. Revolts broke out in Holland. Anti-French units were formed in Switzerland. Prussia liberated Berlin. Austria took Tyrol. Even in Italy, the French administration was beginning to come apart at the seams. Napoleon was retreating to the Rhine. He was no longer the master of Europe. His world was shrinking to the borders of France itself. But even here, he did not give up. In January 1814, the coalition armies crossed the French border. Alexander I, Blücher, and Schwarzenberg all moved towards Paris from different directions. And at this seemingly dying moment for the empire, Napoleon showed miracles of military skill. He conducted the campaign of the Sixth Coalition in France with rare flexibility. Maneuvering between the enemy columns, he smashed the forces of the Allies piecemeal. Victories at Champaubert, Monreale, and Château-Thierry. These were his last military triumphs. Small detachments struck with surgical precision. Officers and guards followed him. As in the old days, he believed that he could repeat the miracle. But the miracle no longer worked. The Allies were approaching Paris. Napoleon's armies were exhausted. Mobilizations no longer helped. The people were exhausted. The economy was destroyed. Parliament began to openly discuss the possibility of removing the emperor. The Bourbons, the former dynasty, began to be mentioned in political circles again. On March 31st, 1814, the Allies entered Paris. This was a shock for all of France. The city, accustomed to victory parades, was now receiving a foreign army. Alexander I entered solemnly, but without mockery. He declared that he was not looking for revenge, he was looking for peace. There was an oppressive silence at Fontainebleau, where Napoleon was. Generals came one after another, persuading him to abdicate. The Senate had already formed a provisional government. The people did not rise in defense. And finally, after 2 weeks of fighting, on April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated, at first in favor of his son, but the Allies did not recognize this succession. Then he signed a complete abdication. He was allowed to retain the title of emperor, not over France, but over an island. He was assigned the island of Elba, a tiny piece of land off the coast of Tuscany, as his personal possession. He was given security, a small retinue, and was even allowed to have a personal guard. On April 11th, Napoleon said goodbye to the guard on the stone steps of Fontainebleau. He embraced the old soldiers, looked into their eyes for a long time, and said, "I thank you, soldiers." I went with you to glory. Now I go into exile, but your name will live for centuries." Thus ended the First Empire, but not the history of Bonaparte himself, for he was not a man capable of accepting an ending if he felt that one step was still possible. In the spring of 1814, when Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba, a sense of an era had settled over Europe. Many years of war were behind them. The French Empire had fallen apart. The Bourbon dynasty had once again occupied the throne. And in the halls of the Congress of Vienna, under the crystal chandeliers, the old monarchs divided the continent as if it had never shaken to the sound of French drums. But a shadow hung over this apparent calm. Bonaparte was alive, and while he breathed, the world did not feel safe. On Elba, Napoleon found himself not a prisoner, but a ruler in miniature. He was allowed to keep his title. He was given a small staff, his own guard, and a few cannons. He traveled around the island, inspected bridges and fields, gazed out to sea. His energy, which knew no rest, found an outlet in details even in exile. He created statutes, wrote letters, and brought order. But the real object of his attention remained France. During these months, the country had changed. Louis XVIII, who had returned to the throne, tried to be a conciliatory monarch, but there was a gaping chasm between him and the people. The officers of the empire were dismissed. The veterans felt forgotten. The symbols of the revolution and the empire, the flags, the orders, the names of battles, disappeared from the walls and squares. The people felt the cold. The army felt offended. The return to the old order turned out to be not a return to stability, but to alienation. Napoleon watched this closely. He read the reports, caught the rumors, felt ferment. He knew that if he landed, he would not meet with hostility. He believed in it and made up his mind. In February 1815, he left Elba with a small retinue, about 1,000 people, mostly veterans of the Guard, several officers, 1 or 2 doctors, several adjutants. The ship arrived at the shore of the south of France. On March 1st, in the Gulf of Juan, Bonaparte came ashore. He did not lead an army. He led memories. Soldiers sent to arrest him came to meet him and went over to his side. When in Grenoble, he stood before a lined-up battalion and said, "If you want to kill your emperor, here he is before you." No one raised their weapons. People rushed to meet him, wept, shouted his name. He walked through the country like a ghost of old glory, and this ghost turned into reality. Louis XVIII fled from Paris. On March 20th, just 20 days after the landing, Napoleon re-entered the Tuileries. He was emperor again. These 100 days were a time of desperate hope. He promised a new, more liberal constitution, proclaimed an amnesty, and brought back the veterans. He understood that the former absolute power could not be returned. He tried to unite the country, and in some ways, he even succeeded. But in Europe, there were no illusions left. The monarchs gathered in Vienna saw his return not as an act of despair, but as a challenge. The enemy they had driven out had returned, and this meant only one thing. They had to finish him off for once and for all. The Allied powers united again. In the northeast, the forces of the German states and Austria were gathering. In the south, the British offensive in Spain continued. In Belgium, a British corps under the command of the Duke of Wellington was stationed. Nearby, in the area of Namur and Wavre, troops were concentrating, Kingdom of Prussia under Field Marshal Blücher. Napoleon decided not to wait for the blow. He advanced north to forestall the enemy army formation and defeat them piecemeal. His plan repeated the strategy of previous years. A quick offensive, isolating the fronts, a quick victory. On June 16th, he attacked and defeated Blücher's army under the lines. However, the victory was incomplete. The troops were not destroyed, but retreated in an organized manner, maintaining their fighting capacity. On June 18th, he met Wellington near the village of Atherloo. The terrain was unfavorable. After the rains, the soil was soggy. The cavalry was losing momentum. The British troops occupied the hills and farms, fortifying them, building a dense defense. Napoleon expected to crush the British before fresh forces arrived on the battlefield from the east. He knew that Blucher's army was still somewhere nearby. The battle lasted all day. The French cavalry attacked with fury. The Guard held out to the last. The flanks changed hands again and again, but the British lines did not break. And when fresh units began to appear on the field, the same ones that had retreated from the line earlier, the situation changed completely. The army that he had not managed to finish off was now striking from the flank. Napoleon threw the old Guard into battle. These were his best units, tested, drilled, loyal to the end. But even they could not turn the tide of the battle. When they began to retreat, a murmur spread across the field. The Guard was retreating. This was the signal. All was lost. The army crumbled. The retreat turned into a flight. France was again left without protection. The emperor returned to Paris, but Paris was different. Here, they no longer expected victory. Here, they expected the end. 4 days after Waterloo, on June 22, 1815, Napoleon abdicated for the second time throne. He no longer asked for his son to inherit the throne. He only hoped to be left alone. He wanted to flee to America, anywhere, but the British fleet had closed the ports. He surrendered to an English captain, hoping for honor and generosity. But the English decided otherwise. They did not bring him to London. They did not give him to France. They sent him to a place from which he would not return. The island of Sennac, Helena, in the middle of the Atlantic, 1,000 miles from the nearest land. A small piece of land, devoid of trees, with a harsh climate and a British garrison. Here, he was to die, not as a hero on the battlefield, but as an exile in silence, where the only weapons were paper and memory. When the English ship Northumberland set out to sea and headed south, everything was already decided. Napoleon no longer belonged to France, Europe, the army, or even to the history of the moment. He was leaving the world in which he had operated and moving into a world of memories, reflections, regrets, and slow decay. The journey took 2 months. He spent the summer of 1815 in his cabin, looking at the endless horizon. As the ship crossed the equator, the soldiers held traditional maritime ceremonies. He did not participate. He knew that this was not just a voyage. This was a funeral procession that was still taking place during his lifetime. The island of St. Helena, where he was to spend the rest of his days, turned out to be exactly as the British had imagined it: harsh, isolated, and cold. Rocks, wind, endless ocean, a garrison, and silence. He arrived there in October 1815 and soon settled in the Longwood estate, a gloomy, windy house standing on a hill from which not a single ship was visible on the horizon. It was like a prison without bars, from which escape was impossible due to geography. A few loyal officers, servants, and doctors remained with him. Among them were General Bertrand, Marshal Gourgaud, and Count Lascaux. It was Lascaux who would become his first interlocutor and the first chronicler of these years. Napoleon dictated his memoirs to him. On long evenings, with the wind howling outside, he talked about Egypt, Toulon, Marengo, and Austerlitz. He returned to old campaigns, analyzed the defeat, justified himself, explained, and argued, no longer with his opponents, but with history. These stories became the basis for the famous memoirs from St. Helena. Napoleon was creating himself anew, not just as a military leader, but as a figure of destiny. He spoke not as an exile, but as a prophet. For him, this was his last battle, a battle for how he would be remembered, and he was not going to lose it. But the years took their toll. The damp climate, nerves, poor nutrition, conflicts with the new British governor, Hudson Lowe, who strictly controlled his every step. All this destroyed his health. Pain, insomnia, bouts of fatigue, and irritability appeared. In letters, he increasingly complained about loneliness, about the betrayal of Europe, about the injustice of his fate. He read a lot: Cicero, Titus Livius, Plutarch, and spent hours in the garden, slowly walking among the bushes. Sometimes, when it was raining, he just sat by the window and looked into the gray fog. He continued to follow politics, received old newspapers, discussed the situation in France, and predicted revolutions. He lived in the past, but thought about the future. In the spring of 1821, his condition worsened sharply. Doctors suspected stomach cancer, the disease from which his father died. The symptoms were excruciating. He lost weight, suffered from fevers, and could not eat. He spent his last weeks in bed, almost without getting up. He had no strength left, neither for dictation nor for walks. On May 5th, 1821, in the afternoon, he asked to read his will. In it, he asked to be buried on the banks of the Seine, next to the French people whom, according to him, he always loved. Towards evening, he lost consciousness. His last words, according to eyewitnesses, were, "France, Army, Vanguard, Josephine." He died far from his homeland, without glory, without crowds, without flags. His body was placed in a modest sarcophagus and buried under a willow in the shade, where there were no monuments or epitaphs. They did not write his name over the grave, only, "Here he rests." But the peace was short-lived. 20 years later, in 1840, France asked England for the right to return Napoleon's ashes to his homeland. Millions. Napoleon met him in Paris. They boarded a funeral barge. The streets were strewn with flags. People were crying. Boys were putting on their uniforms. Old men were remembering their campaigns. He was buried in a home for the disabled, in a huge crypt under a dome, where even the architecture bows before his name. Thus ended the journey of a man who began as an unknown artillery officer from the island of Corsica and became a symbol of the most turbulent era in the history of Europe. He was loved, he was feared, he was cursed, but no one could forget him because, as they would say one day, he was not just a man, he was an era fighting eternity. He lived only 51 years, less than many rulers, less than many generals. But his life contained what others would not have had time for in centuries. He rose swiftly and fell with deafening force. He was a student of artillery and the ruler of Europe, an outcast and a legislator, a dictator and a reformer. He combined cruelty and genius, cold calculation, and a passionate faith in fate. He did not leave behind a dynasty, a stable system, or a calm legacy, but he left behind an era. After him, nothing was the same. War became different. Politics became different. Europe became different. He destroyed the old order, but in its ruins, he also sowed new ideas. Equality before the law, civil liberties, and the right to talent. Centuries have passed, but the debate about him has not ended. For some, he is a despot and usurper. For others, a genius and a hero. For everyone, he is a mystery to which you want to return again and again. Empires disappear, monuments are destroyed, but history, told in the first person, the story of a man who challenged the entire world, remains.